everyone. Today let's learn about the Spring MVC framework. Spring MVC is nothing but the model view controller. These are the robust, flexible and well-designed framework that is used for developing the web application. The Spring provides a clear and flexible combination of model, view and controller which are used for developing the web application. The agenda for today is learning the introduction to the Spring MVC, features of the Spring MVC framework and exploring the different components of the Spring MVC framework. So, Spring MVC or the Spring Web Model View Controller Framework is a robust, flexible and well-designed framework that is used for developing the web application. Model stands for the data of the web application, view in the sense the user interface, how it exactly appears to the user. For example, if we open the gmail.com website, gmail.com, what happens there? We can see the username, password and the submit button or forgot password and other information. So whatever that makes the user to understand, the page that makes the user to understand quickly, that page is known as the view or the user interface, or in other words it is also known as graphical user interface. Controller is the one or a mechanism which processes the user request. So here whatever the end user will see will be only the view part. It is neither the model nor the controller. So the model and controller part are completely in control with the developer. Only he can view, he can edit, he can see. View part the end user can see or the client person can see. So the checkbox, text box, buttons, everything comes under the view. Controller and model part will be in the hands of the developer, which helps in processing the user request. So with the help of the Spring web application, we can integrate the struts as well, struts application as well and other frameworks as well. So the Spring framework helps in integrating various other view technologies like Java server pages, or in other words JSP, velocity, tiles and free markers in a Spring application. So now here we are learning mainly the features of the Spring Web MVC. So the first and foremost thing or the feature is the powerful configuration of the framework and application classes. So what Spring does is, the Spring MVC Web MVC framework, it provides a very powerful and straightforward configuration of framework as well as the application classes like Java beans. So these Java beans are nothing but a plain old Java object. So it is very powerful as well as it also provides a straightforward approach of combination of the Spring framework as well as the application classes. Also the second feature is it helps in easier testing. Most of the Spring classes are designed using Java beans. So these Java beans, since they are plain old Java objects, it helps us to inject the test data very easily, having the setters and getter methods, and it also provides the handling of HTTP requests and responses. The third feature is separation of roles. Each component in the Spring MVC framework performs its own role during the request handling. That is, a request is first handled by a validator or a controller. So now let's come to the third feature of the Spring Web MVC, wherein we are having the separation of roles. What exactly is separation of roles? Each and every component of the Spring Web MVC framework, it performs its own role. That is, when a request is needed to be handled by the components, so here each component will have its own role. The display is done by the view or the UI, the controller, the validator, the command object, form object, model object, view resolver, which we talk about later, and the handler mapping interface. The whole task is dependent on these components, and there is a clear picture of the separation of the roles of each. Flexibility. The fourth feature is the flexibility. Flexibility in choosing the controller subclasses. Any controller or the interface can be used in the Spring MVC application. We are having several controller classes like abstract controller, multi-action controller to handle the requests. So instead of having a single controller for this, we are having separation of this controller. Next, no need to create duplication of code. That is, if we can use the existing business code in any component of the Spring MVC application. We need not duplicate the code. That will never arise actually. So the existing code can be used in the forms or the command objects which we are typing. So there is no need to duplicate this code. Next is specific validation and binding. So validation in the sense the validation errors. So when there is any mismatch in the data entered in the form or anything, the validation errors will be displayed then and there itself. Next, model transfer flexibility. There is a flexibility in the model transferring and it is accepted by any technology. Specific local and theme resolution. The Spring Web MVC framework provides support for JSPs, Java Server Pages, and without or with the Spring tag library or the Spring TLD. TLDs are nothing but tag libraries. So it also supports other technologies like JSTL, Java Server Pages, Standard Tag Library, and Velocity. The facility and the Spring Form Tag Library. The facility, this framework, the Spring Framework allows a user to use the Spring Form Tag Library to develop UI components like the button, the checkbox, text box, etc. in a JSP page. Exploring the components of the Spring Web MVC framework. This is the second part of our agenda for today. So here what is happening is we are discussing about the various components in the Spring Web MVC framework like the dispatcher servlet class, which is very important while learning the Spring Web MVC framework. Along with that, we are also learning the handler mapping interface, controller interfaces. These can be called as the building blocks of the Spring Web MVC framework understanding. So these are very significant components. So the dispatcher class, the dispatcher servlet class. The dispatcher servlet class is an important part of the Spring Web MVC framework. It is used for intercepting the incoming requests and determining which controller handles the request. It is fully configured with the inversion of controller container, which allows us to use various Spring features like the Spring Context, Spring ORM, and Spring DAO, Data Access Objects, etc. It is a servlet basically which handles the HTTP request and is inherited from the HTTP servlet base class. What is the function of the dispatcher servlet class? It is just like a front the function of the dispatcher servlet class is like a friend controller, where each request goes through the controller. This class can be used in the SpringWebMVC application if it is configured in the web.xml file of any web application. We can consider the below code snippet. What is happening here is we are declaring the dispatcher servlet class in the web.xml file. Servlet, the tag is the first is the servlet name, servlet class. Load on startup and the servlet will be enclosed here. So the name of the servlet here is my dispatcher servlet, and the class from which it is inherited is org.springframework.web.servlet.dispatcher servlet. So in this code snippet, the user defined name of the dispatcher servlet is my dispatcher servlet, which is enclosed between the element. This is an element. Servlet name is an element. So when our newly created my dispatcher servlet class is loaded in a web application, what happens? It loads an application context from the XML file, that is web.xml file. In the SpringWebMVC framework, the name of the XML file is prefixed with the name of the dispatcher servlet class. Therefore, we can say that dispatcher servlet class loads my dispatcher servlet.xml file from an application context. Also, one more thing related to dispatcher servlet class is, after declaring this dispatcher servlet class, the next task is to map this my dispatcher servlet class with the incoming request. That is, that incoming request indicates what URLs are handled by the dispatcher servlet class. For example, it comes under the URL pattern element, URL pattern star.htm, or whichever the request comes within that URL pattern tag. To that element, this class will be mapped. So that code snippet basically will have the servlet mapping element with the servlet name and the URL pattern. So that URL pattern will basically have star.htm or star.html. Servlet name will have this name, that is my dispatcher servlet name, and it is enclosed between the servlet mapping element. Next, let's learn about the handler mapping interface. The handler mapping interface is a technique which handles the execution of the controllers and helps us match a specified URL. This interface is used for mapping the interface incoming request to the appropriate handlers. What are these handlers? These are actually simple controllers that provide the handle request method to forward our request. So the SpringWebMVC framework provides the handler mapping interface to facilitate this technique and for handling the incoming requests. This interface is also used for delivering the handler execution chain object. So what is handler execution chain object? It is nothing but an object which contains the handlers that should match with the incoming request. So this handler mapping interface also has a list of interceptors. So what are these interceptors? These interceptors are nothing but that can be applied or implemented according to however the request is. So those are the simple URL handler mapping class and the bname URL handler mapping class.
Hello, we already discussed in our previous session that
The handler mapping interface is a technique which handles the execution of the controllers and helps us match a specified URL. That is, it is used for mapping the incoming requests to the appropriate handlers, which are those handlers are actually the simple controllers which provide the handle request method to forward our request. So, to implement this handler mapping interface, the SpringWebMVC framework provides two classes. The first is the bean name URL handler mapping class and the simple URL handler mapping class. Both of these classes are the examples or the implementations of the handler mapping interface. The following properties are shared by them. Those are interceptors, default handlers, order, URL decode, always use full path, lazy init handlers. Among these, the three properties, that is always use full path, URL decode, that is these three, the last three, URL decode, always use full path and lazy init handlers are only available to the subclass of the abstract URL handler mapping class. Now let's go one by one. What are these interceptors? Interceptors are used to process each request before or after it has been processed by an appropriate controller. Second is the default handler. When is this used? It is used when there is no matching handler specified in a SpringWebMVC application. This will be used as a default handler property. Next, order. What is an order? Order means it sorts all the handler mappings available in the context based on the value of the order property used in the SpringWebMVC framework. After sorting all the handler mappings, that is, the Spring framework applies the handler which matches first in the context. Next comes the URL decode. URL decode is used for decoding or encoding of the URL path. If it is false, the encoded URL path is used for handling a request. The default value of this URL decode will always be true. Next is always use full path. It is the URL path that is used to search a particular URL path in the servlet context to find an appropriate handler. For example, we are having something like /visualpath/output.html. Such path is known as always use full path. The value of it, default value of it is always false. Last is the lazy init handler. This property is used for runtime initialization or the lazy initialization of the singleton handler. As the prototype handlers, its default value is false. Let's go ahead with the two important implementations of the handler mapping interface. The first one is bname URL handler mapping class. Next is simple URL handler mapping class. The bname URL handler mapping class is a very powerful and simple type of class which implements the handler mapping interface. It maps the incoming HTTP request with the names of the beans that are defined in the web application context. So now let's see how it is done, how to use it, the code snippet on how to use it. So here the beans, it will be enclosed between the beans property. So here beans element, beans, bean ID, handler. So now let's begin with the bname URL handler mapping class. It is a very simple but powerful type of class which implements the handler mapping interface. It maps the incoming HTTP request with the names of the beans that are defined in the web application context. Let's see a code snippet which shows how we can use the bname URL handler mapping class to map the HTTP request with the URL. Say employee account form or something of that sort. So let's see the beans element. Bean ID is equal to handler mapping. Class is org.springframework.web.servlet.handler.beanname URL handler mapping. So the bean name here is /employee_account.form. We are mapping the handler mapping to this particular URL, that is employee_account.form, and the class is org.springframework.web.servlet.mvc.simpleFormController. So we are in this preceding example, what we are having is this bname URL handler mapping class. It enables the user to insert an employee account based on the appropriate form controller and the JSP page. Since there is a mapping here between the HTTP request that is incoming with the employee account.form, all the details are inserted into the employee account. So we also need some more code snippet, that is we need to write a code wherein the servlet, that is the servlet mapping also needs to be enabled, that is between the servlet element, the servlet name, servlet class, load on startup, that code needs to be present, and within the servlet mapping we also need to have the URL path or the URL pattern, that is star.html form, from where we need to map the handler mapping to the employee account. The next part here is the simple URL handler mapping class. This class is used to handle more complex URLs. It is configured in the application context and compiles the rules of matching the URLs related to the following characters. For example, if we are having question mark, it is used to match one character, that is wildcard characters, and star is or the asterisk character is used to match 0 or more characters. Double star or the double asterisk is used to match all the directories in a path, irrespective of whether there are no directories mentioned in the URL. Or it can also be numerous directories mentioned in the URL, 0 or more. For example, we are having visual path slash double asterisk slash test.html. It means 0 or more number of directories in that particular URL. So under the visual path, how many directories are present underneath the visual path? Everything will come under double asterisk. Next is the SpringWebMVC controller. The SpringMVC web controller framework provides controllers which are based on MVC paradigm. The dispatcher servlet class, as we already discussed, is a controller. The main task of this controller is to receive requests from the dispatcher servlet class and to perform some business logic in accordance with the client request. Controllers in the SpringWebMVC framework are somewhat like the actions in struts. As we would have seen in struts how we have the actions. Similar to that, these controllers will perform their task. But they are more than one in number within the SpringWebMVC web framework. On the other hand, in struts, it performs a single action, but here they are more than one in number. The SpringWebMVC controller framework provides controllers which are based on the MVC methodology or the paradigm. The first class, that is the dispatcher servlet class, is a controller which is based on the MVC paradigm and which is quite significant in the SpringWebMVC framework, which is very important actually. To implement the behavior of the SpringWebMVC application, we need to extend one of the Spring controllers. The main task of this particular controller, what is the main task of this? Is to receive the requests from the dispatcher servlet class and to perform some business logic in accordance with the client request. Based on the client request, how to perform some business logic over it. So controllers in this SpringWebMVC framework are similar to the actions in servlets, but they are more in number in the SpringWebMVC framework than when compared to the struts, which are single. That is, there is only one controller in struts, but here there can be more than one. There are more than one. Controllers can be used in different scenarios. One is while handling a particular form request or while handling some multi-action request. Whereas in struts, the action form or the action class is used to handle the client request. One single action class of the action form. The SpringWebMVC framework provides different kinds of controllers like the form-specific controller or the command-based controller. The controller interface comes at the top of the SpringMVC framework, where we need to implement a custom controller class to handle the client request. So let's consider the code snippet here. What exactly is happening in the code snippet here? That is, the public interface controller, model and view. Here what is happening here is we are processing the request and returning a model and view object. Model and view, it's a one single keyword. Model and view object, so that the dispatcher servlet will render that. So how we can write it? Model and view handle request, HTTP servlet request. This is the class and an object. HTTP servlet response throws the exception. It returns null. That is, in this particular code snippet, the controller interface defines a method called handle request. This method is responsible for handling the client request. As the name itself suggests, it handles the client request. This method also returns an appropriate model and view, but what is happening here is it returns null. That is, no view is returned by it, is what is the meaning of it. Therefore, the SpringWebMVC framework, the MVC paradigm is handled by the model and view class. It's a class. The controller is the interface and the Spring form tag library. There are various types of the controllers in the SpringWebMVC framework, which receives the HTTP servlet request and the HTTP servlet response. These controllers are mainly, which we can see here, the next slide, abstract controller, multi-action controller and command controllers. So we first see the abstract controller. Abstract controller is the basic controller in the SpringWebMVC application framework. So all the Spring controllers are inherited from this abstract controller class. This controller class provides an abstract implementation of the controller interface. The abstract controller class extends the web content generator class. That is another class which what is done using it. It allows us to set the different configuration properties to control the requests and the responses. So those properties are like the cache in seconds, the sessions, supported methods, synchronization sessions. Such properties we are having, which we learn in the future. So right now let's see the code snippet of this abstract controller. That is, let's consider this abstract controller. So the code snippet says public is here com.visualPath is the package name. Public class sample controller extends abstract controller. Model and view is the class which is returned at, that is, this particular code snippet returns an object MV in the form type of a class model and view. The message that is displayed here is have a nice day. That's it. So what is happening here? We are overriding this handle request internal HTTP request and HTTP servlet response method, which returns model and view kind of an object to display an appropriate web page. So the declaration of the web application context allows us to set a handler mapping here. So this is how we use the abstract controller. Next is the multi-action controller. This is also another class which is a special type of container which supports a group of multiple request handling methods. Or in other words, we can say it puts the methods all together into one single controller. It allows the group of the related functions or action into one controller, one single controller, though it performs multiple actions. The multi-action controller class provides two kinds of properties, namely delegate and method name resolver. These properties are used to determine the object required to invoke each request. What does the delegate do? The delegate property can be used in two scenarios. First scenario, if the delegate property is not null, what will happen? A method is invoked based on the delegate property. In the second scenario, if the delegate property is null, then the controller, what it does is, it searches out for a method based on the multi-action controller subclass. Let's see in the code snippets how this works. The method name resolver property. What this property does is, it is used for resolving the method names based on the specific incoming HTTP servlet request and the HTTP servlet request class, that is the object of its kind. Next, the method name resolver property of this particular multi-action controller class is injected by the method name resolver interface. We're also having method name resolver interface. So this particular interface is implemented by some classes like internal path method name. Let's see the code snippet which shows us how to use the multi-action controller class with the parameter method name resolver class. So here, what exactly is parameter method name resolver? So the parameter method name resolver is a class which basically implements the method name resolver interface. It's a class. So it implements the method name resolver interface. The method name defined in the parameter method name resolver class is taken from the given request parameter. Whatever the given request parameter value has, that will be taken. Its default parameter name is action, but we can change the parameter name from the context file. So now let's see what is the properties method name resolver. This properties method name resolver is another class which implements again the method name resolver interface. The method name defined in the properties method name resolver class is taken from the external properties which we configure, properties file. So here what is happening in this code snippet? The package name is com.visualPath. Property name, as we already discussed, it's the delegate property. And here what is happening is, this snippet is used to search the method parameter name. That's it. This method, the property name parameter name is the method name. This parameter name method is being searched within the context file. That is what is happening here. Next is the command controller. What are these? These are the third controller. We were discussing the command controllers part. So this is the third part. So wherein it is an essential part of the Spring MVC framework. So these controllers, what they does is they allow the objects, the particular objects properties to be populated in the HTML form submission. So when the data is entered by the user, what this controller does is it allows the object's properties to be populated in the HTML form. Also, it provides an easy way to handle the requests within the request parameters. How it does that? By binding the request parameters with the command objects. It is almost similar to the action form in Struts framework. So, below are the command controllers in the Spring framework. One is the abstract command controller, second is the abstract form controller, simple form controller, and finally the abstract wizard form controller. So let's see each one of these. Abstract command controller. This is used for creating your own command controller. Abstract, our own command controller we can create. It facilitates the data validation and data binding for the HTML form submission. Basically, this particular controller is used for binding a form request parameter with the data object that we specify. Next is the abstract form controller. Here, this controller extends from the abstract command controller class, which we already saw previously. And what this controller does is it supports the HTML form submission again, and also it is used for modeling an HTML form and populates the HTML form by using its command object. Next is the simple form controller. This controller is used to process the HTML form submission again, but the thing is, this is used for creating a form with the corresponding command object. This controller helps also the user to submit an HTML form by specifying that particular command object for the HTML form. Next is the abstract wizard form controller. It is an abstract class which extends from the abstract form controller class. So, how we can use this? We need to implement the validate page method. There is something called validate page method which checks whether the data is on the current page and whether it is valid or not. So that particular method checks whether the data on that particular current page is valid or not, and by using, now let's have a look at the model and view class which we have been discussing since the beginning of this session. So here we all know that it's a class, but what it does is it holds a view or the web page and a model of the SpringWebMVC framework, which contains the bean names as well as the corresponding objects. Let's, for example, consider it in a way that it is in the form of a form or a page, web page. View is configured either through a bean name or in properties file, or by implementing the view resolver interface. That is also one of the very important interfaces in Spring application, that is view resolver interface. Every controller's execution must return a model and view instance that comprises both of a view and a model. If nothing is returned, the return part will be null. So we can see the code snippet here that shows the instance of the model and view class returned by a controller. So how it appears? Public class myController extends the abstract controller class. Public model and view handle request internal. HTTP servlet request, HTTP servlet response throws an exception. So the snippet is as follows. The syntax is new model and view items list items 1, items 2. Here, the first parameter items list is a logical name that has been given for the view, which can be displayed as the output of the myController class. The view resolver, what it does is, it's an interface which uses the item list parameter to look up the actual view to display the output. The next two parameters, items 1 and items 2, these are needed to be forwarded to that particular views. They represent the model and the model objects. These two represents the model objects. Also, they are expressed in the form of model and name value pairs, name and their value. The second parameter is the name of the model and it is used by the third parameter. Second is the name of the model. Next is the view resolver interface. We have been using this since the beginning, but we need to understand what exactly it is. View resolver is basically an interface that manages the mapping between the logical and actual views. So, what are those views? A bean that implements the view resolver interface is used for resolving a view. So, implementation is as shown below. First implementation of view resolver interface is by the URL based view resolver. Next is the XML based view resolver. Third is the resource bundle view resolver. Last but not the least, how we chain all these view resolvers into one. Chaining of the view resolvers, that is also one of the implementations. So first is by the URL based view resolver class. This URL based view resolver class implements the view resolver interface, as we all know. Why it does is to map the logical view with the URLs. So this class uses a URL to render response in the form of view technologies like JSPs, velocities and XSLTs. That is extensible style sheets, language transformation, that is the full form. So those two classes are internal resource view resolver and the velocity view resolver class. So what is this internal resource view resolver? This class is used for setting a specific view class to render a page, web page or a view. So what is the velocity view resolver? This class is used when some specific velocity properties are applied to all the views in a web application. One is for the specific view. The internal resource view resolver is used for setting a specific view to render a view, whereas the velocity view resolver is used for some specific velocity properties pertaining to all the views in the web application. So we are having the code snippet understanding here. My view resolver, the class is, as we already know, it is internal resource view resolver. So what is happening here? The view resolver is known as the my view resolver here, which returns here login as a view name. When the path here, let's consider this as the path, prefix value webin JSP view value. Below it's some value dot JSP is the suffix. So what is happening here? Anything that ends with .jsp will be returned here. That is, for example, if we are having the view resolver login page to be login, then here this will return login as a view name. Login as a view name, the page will be /webinf/ JSP view / login.jsp. Here it will be login.jsp. So implementation of this view resolver interface by the XML view resolver class. This class is used to retrieve views or the web pages from a bean factory. The XML view resolver class implements the view resolver interface that accepts an XML file with the same definition as used in the bean factory of the SpringWebMVC application. For example, we are having the Excel view resolver and the class is XML view resolver. This is the name of the bean here. So what is happening here? The views are declared in a separate file. That file is views.xml as is mentioned here. That is located within the webinf/views views.xml, a directory, separate directory. It wires up with the XML view resolver here, this class, and mapped. That is what is happening here. So that is how it works. Next, the implementation is by the resource bundle view resolver class. This class, what it does is, it implements the view resolver interface that uses the bean definition in a resource bundle instead of the XML files. What exactly is resource bundle? Resource bundle is the name of the properties file. That's it. It's nothing but the configuration properties that are present in the properties file. Everything will be named as the resource bundle, which is located in the class path. Definitely, it will be located also in webinf. All the properties and JSPs, usually it will come under webinf. Webinf classes views.properties. This is a separate properties file where all the configurations are done related to the login page, item page, index page, or everything. All the JSP page as well as the JSTL view, everything. So this is how it looks like in the properties file. Here, if we see this code snippet, it is nothing but how we are using the resource bundle view resolver class and how it is configured within the bean configuration file. The class is resource bundle view. It is configured within the bean configuration file. So the resource bundle view class, what it does is it loads the resource bundle using the test name property. This is the property here. Test name is the property. Here the property is to set the views, which means that the view definition, whatever is defined in the views.properties file, everything will be set here. Set, all those views are set here. So we are configuring the resource bundle view class in the bean configuration file. Next is chaining of all these view resolvers. So since the SpringWebMVC framework supports more than one view resolver for resolving a view, the process is known as chaining of view resolvers. That is the terminology used. So chaining of view resolver is nothing but it is very simple as it involves just adding more than one view is resolver. That's it. There is nothing more complex here. As we already started discussing the chaining of view resolvers, SpringWebMVC framework provides the chaining of view resolvers, that is supporting more than one view resolver. It is a straightforward approach, that is mapping between the logical and the actual views is what is done here. It is very simple as it involves adding more than one view resolver to a particular application context. The higher the order property of the view resolver, the later is the position in the chain. Though it appears to be simple, it requires addition of the view resolver and certain stands on it. The order is a very important terminology that we need to know here. So it also needs some work on various different technologies like knowing of JSPs, PDFs and Excels. Though it is a straightforward way of chaining the resolvers, we need to know how we simply add more resolvers in an application context. That part we need to know. So when a what exactly here we are doing is, we can set the order property of different view resolvers. The order property is used for specifying the order of the view resolver that is to be executed first in an application context. When a particular view resolver of Spring does not load a view, Spring examines that particular application context to find the other configured view resolver. If the Spring application finds an additional view resolver, it continues to inspect that particular view resolver. Otherwise, if it doesn't find one, it will throw an exception. So, if it doesn't find anything, it will automatically returns null value, that is for sure. So, let's see how it is done here. So, BeanID JSP view resolver class, there is a separate class org.springframework.webservlet.view internal resource view resolver. Here we are having three things. One is the internal view resolver. We can also have, in the place of this JSP view resolver, we can also have a separate ID Excel view resolver, that is for Excels, and Bean view resolver for the beans. So JSP view resolver for the JSP. So that is why this is known as chaining of the view resolvers. Chaining. This process is hence called the chaining of the view resolver. We can chain or we can add on different technology usage here. So in the place of JSP, we are having Excel view resolver or the Bean view resolver or the JSP view resolver, that is dependent on our requirement. Next, one of the easiest and most important part of any UI design or the MVC framework is understanding of the view components, which are the main components which the user can access or user can see. Mainly these view components are done for the understanding to the end user, keeping in mind the end user. Even a novice or a unknown person, if he accesses a particular web page, how it has to appear to him. That is what is mentioned in the view components. An end user without any knowledge of the technology, even he should be able to view and access the particular page. See, for example, if we go for any banking application or a travel domain in all these sectors, the user interface is what mainly it is accessed. Nobody, either end user or a banker or whoever or a transport person, nobody accesses the controller part or the model part here. Everyone they will access the view part. See, if we go for our Gmail ID, we see the username and password. We will not see what the background work is done and all. If being an end user or an application client and all. So this view components understanding as a developer, it's very, very, very important. Keeping in the end user or the client point of view, this is what is very, very important. How it appears, how the graphics are done, how the pages appear, how the HTML JSPs are done. All these things are the dynamic parts are very, very important to understand. Sorry, not the dynamic, the static resources like the HTML pages, graphics. Understanding this part is very, very important. Keeping, as we already learned, that the view components are the user interface components in the MVC paradigm, like the text box, checkbox, radio buttons, etc. These items are responsible for displaying the output of any Spring MVC or any, for that matter, any MVC application. View components display the data produced by the JSP pages and servlets along with the static resources like HTML pages, PDF files and graphics. So, our SpringWebMVC framework also provides a set of tags in the form of a tag library, which is also known as Spring Form Tag Library. Spring Tag Library. This tag library is used to construct views or the web page views. So, Spring Form Tag Library, what all it consists of? This library is basically a collection of tags that are form and input. So, each tag can have a set of attributes. It can have a set of attributes like the command name, path, etc., which allow the developer to develop the UI components to the JSP page or the HTML page. This tag library comes with the tag library descriptors, or also known as TLDs, tag library descriptors. That is basically known as Spring form.tld, which is available in the web application. So it is known as a Spring, once again, Spring form.tld, tag library descriptor. So basically how this context of the Spring form tag library consists of, what all it consists of, we will see here in the below tags. So before that, let's know that there is a code snippet called taglib. Taglib prefix equals forms, where the URL is org.w.website springframework.org/tags/forms, which we see in our examples later. So that will be on the top, how to use the Spring form tag library. We'll see next. Now let's see what are all the tags in the context of the Spring form library. So first is the form tag, second is the input tag, third is the checkbox, checkboxes, radio button, radio buttons, password, select, option, options, a text area, hidden, and errors tag. These are the most frequently used. Now let's see one by one, that is the form tag. The form tag is used to generate an HTML form tag in any of the JSP pages of the Spring application. What is it used for? It is used for binding the inner tags, which means that all the other tags are nested, like how we use the braces. Similar to that, this form tag acts as the nesting of other tags. Using this form tag, the inner tags can access that particular command object, which resides in the JSP's page context class. So let's see a code snippet to understand this. Form action. This is the action that is mapping to the login.html. Command name is client from the client part. So table consists of the table rows and the table data. Your name. So your name appears. So what happens in the blank side of the your name, the next tab? It will have the input path is equal to name. Age. Here input path is equal to age. We can enter the age. Submit. After entering the name and age, submit. Value is saved. Submit and get it saved. So the application form, we can imagine this as an application form wherein we are having the name and age to be entered by the user. So user will enter the name and user will enter the age and submit. Submit is as good as saving it to the DB. Saving it to the DB. So this is what is the syntax for the form action. This is the login page. In other words, it looks like the login page of any Gmail or any, for that matter, any bank login. Similar to that, we are doing here the entering of the username and the age. Usually we'll have username and the password, but here this is for our understanding. We are having the username and the age. So for up to 4 columns it will take, and saving the value. Learned the form tag is used to generate a HTML form tag in any of the JSP pages of the Spring application. It is basically used to bind the inner tags, which means that all the other tags are nested inside the form tag, as we already discussed. And here, if we consider this as the login page, here the form method is posting to the next web page. This is very important part here. This is one of the other implementation of the form method. Next is the input tag. Input tag is also the most important tag in the UI. So what it is used for? It is used for entering the set text by the end users. We can enter, or the novice user or anybody can enter the text in any of the JSP pages of the Spring application. So form action is equal to login.html. Command name is client. Table, your name. Here form input. This specifies the blank tab or the blank space in which the user can input the fields name and age. It is nothing but, it means client. Here if we consider this client dot name, client dot age, that is what is the meaning of this tab. Next is, and submit is as good as saving that particular page with the values, name and age. Next is the checkbox. This is a well-known tag wherein if we are having some question like are you interested in the hobbies? Yes or no, we will click the checkbox. So here, or if there are multiple checkboxes, we will use the checkboxes tag here. So how it is used? Let's see here. The type of the tag will be clicked here, or a set of tags we can click here. Have you interest? If this is the question that will come inside the table row, table data, form : checkbox path client.interest. So here, if there are multiple checkboxes, we will have to select the checkboxes path is equal to customer.hobbies. Hobbies list will come here. If we are having multiple hobbies like singing, dancing, stamp collection, etc., we can tick all the things. So it is like multi-column, multiple checkboxes, multiple HTML tags within the Spring application. The form : checkboxes is the syntax. Next comes the radio button. Radio button tag is used to represent the HTML input tag with the radio type in the JSP pages of the HTML application. What exactly this radio button does? It is used when there are many tag instances having the same property with different values. Property is same but the value will be different. Like example, marital status. It can be married or unmarried. So we can click on one of these. It doesn't have multi-selection here. It can be yes or no, that's it. So yes or no boolean type also works with the radio button. So here M status is nothing but the string property. It is bound to radio button tags. So we must remember that during the runtime, only one radio button can be activated or selected with the help of this M status property. Next, we also have the radio buttons tab, wherein similar to the checkboxes tag, we also have radio buttons. The difference is it represents one HTML input with radio type, but the radio buttons, it will take multiple HTML inputs with the radio type. So, and the value is again supplied at the runtime. It is almost similar to the working of the checkboxes input. Next is the password. Password tag is very important, as we all know that for any application, password is the most secured feature, wherein by default the browser does not show the password field to the whoever the user is, or the developer, or even the end user. We were learning about the password tag. Password tag is used for representing the HTML input tag again of the type password in any of the JSP pages of the Spring application. By default, the browser does not show the value of the password field. We can show the value of the password field by setting the show password attribute to be true. Usually this show password attribute will be there inside this form : password itself. If we enable it as true, then we can see whatever the password is, but usually it will be made as false, or it will not be enabled at all. So form : password path is equal to password is the syntax that is generally used. Next is the most important tag, it is select tag. This tag is used to represent the HTML select tag in any of the JSP pages of the Spring application. It is also somewhat similar to the checkbox tag, where we select the tag for binding the selected application with its value. For example, languages known, if we want to select the languages known, like for example Hindi, English, French, Kannada, or whatever, then we are selecting the language here. Selection of the language. So it comes as form : select path is equal to language. Item is equal to items is equal to $language, whichever the language that we can select here. So select name is equal to language. Option will come here, where option value is equal to Hindi, option value is equal to French, option value can be English or whichever the language is. Next, so this option tag is already here. What it does is, it is used to represent the HTML option tag in any of the JSP pages of a Spring application, where we need to add all the options of the select tag. So form action is equal to country display. If we want to display the country or the city name, what we do here the place is form option value. Bangalore, New Delhi, Hyderabad, Chennai, etc. Here one of these options will be selected. So we need to add all the options to the select tag. We do not add the items attribute to select tag, but we need to add all the options inside the select tag. Next is options. Options is nothing but a list of HTML option tag is the options tag, where we will have items is equal to $place list, where all the list will come in by default one by one. It will be accessed in a single row. Next is the text area. Text area, as we all know, if we want to write some important notes in a elaborated manner, we use the text area tag, where the user has to manually type the description or whatever. So in any JSP page of a Spring application, if there are any important notes or anything of that sort which requires writing row wise and column wise a number of descriptions, then we can use this text area. So form text area path is equal to notes, rows how many, columns how many, we can specify. Also here form errors path is equal to notes. What is errors tag here? It is used to represent an HTML errors field in a JSP page of a Spring application. To access the errors defined in a validator class. For example, if we want to submit a form and find all the errors related to the name and the password fields in that particular form, if we have to define all the validation errors related to these fields in a validator class, which must implement the validator interface. So here how it appears is, implementing this validator class, validate validation utils.reject if empty errors. So name field is required, password field is required. These are the, if the name field and password field both should not be empty, both are needed. So in such a case, such an alert will be displayed. That is done using the errors tag. Alert for any mistakes or validation errors or the verification errors will be implemented using the errors tag, which implements the validator interface basically, which comes under the validation utils.